Bonjour tout le monde. Je sais pas.
Hello to all. We can start very soon. We're just trying to find some additional chairs to be able to welcome more people. There are 2 spots in the front. Otherwise, maybe you can stand for the start. Mr. David Grassley, coordinator for Yemen, will be with us from New York, and that's why you've got the interpretation headsets. He will be speaking English. So we should be able to start very soon.
La parole, il faut vous servir des micros. Je sais pas si il faut vous servir des micros pour prendre la parole. Si ça vous va, si vous prenez celui-là et vous... Ouais. Moi j'ai le mien et vous serez obligé de partager. Ça vous va? Bon, on me fait signe qu'on peut commencer.
I am told that we can start. So, hello to all. Thank you for being here. Welcome to this debate on Yemen. Yemen, who once was Arabia Felix, and also the country of the Queen of Saba, but is now undergoing a very long-hauling war opposing the government recognized by the International Committee and directed by the President, Mr. Hadi, opposing the Houthis in the south. The consequences for the civils are terrible. There are millions of people at the brim of starvation, many people displaced, and the UN believes that this is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. The geostrategical position of Yemen, which is between the Middle East and the Horn of Africa, is also attracting attention and interference from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And they are opposing to Iran. They are major rivals engaged in conflict by proxy. There have been major peace talks and even a peace agreement signed in Stockholm in 2018, but the ceasefires so far have never really been kept. So who wants peace in Yemen today? This is the question that we will start to answer during this debate, coordinated with the Institute of the Arab World. So I have with me the honor to have Khadija Al-Salami. You are a documentary maker from Yemen. You're also president of the ONG Future for Yemen. This is an NGO that works on education of children. You have made many documentaries, and we will be showing a part of one of them during this debate. We have with us Gilles Gauthier, advisor of the president of the Arab World Institute, Jack Long, and you recently wrote a work called A Very Close Enemy by Riveneuve. This is a book that you will be able to find in the bookstore just across the road in the library of the forum. We have with us as well Fatiha Dazi-Heni, political scientist specializing in the Arabian Peninsula in the IRSEM at the Strategic Institute. And you have also written a book, which you will be able to find in the library across the road. We have with us the pleasure as well to have David Grassley, the United Nations resident coordinator for Yemen, with us via Zoom. So I would just like to be precise that Mr. Grassley can't stay with us until the end of the debate because he's very busy. He's one of the actors that deploys many actions to end the conflicts and to end the suffering of innocent victims. We will be starting by giving the floor to David Grassley in order to see what the situation is like on the field. David Grassley, what is your vision on the humanitarian situation in Yemen currently? What is your vision?
Thank you very much, first of all, for giving me this opportunity to speak to all of you and to share, as you say, my vision and my understanding of the situation in Yemen today. I think we have to start with the fact that this is a conflict that has been going on for the last 7 years. And that conflict has led to the collapse of the economy inside Yemen, also the collapse of many public services, all of which has created acute poverty, severe poverty throughout the country. And that's the context in which we're working and trying to provide humanitarian assistance today. I've had the opportunity to travel extensively inside Yemen. Many people on the outside don't think it's possible. In fact, it is quite straightforward to move by road throughout the country. So I've been probably over half the governance, usually along the front lines. So I've been able to see up close how this has affected people on the ground. What I see just from the physical side of this is schools that are destroyed, schools that are inaccessible because of landmines, because they've been contaminated through unexploded ordnance. I see villages that people no longer can live in because, once again, contaminated by landmines. Factories that no longer work are destroyed, power systems no longer functional, water systems collapsing, not providing water to their citizens across. This is, and I could go on, but it also, of course, has a human dimension that's extremely. We have been describing this as the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe, and when you travel, you see the evidence of that. Often, and what I try to do often is go into areas that are difficult to access to make sure that we have to make regular access there. And when I do, I really see the desperation often. I'm often surrounded, it's not unusual to be surrounded, but people who just really want to take a hold of, grab me basically and tell me their story. And the most touching stories come from the mothers that are there trying to do the best they can for their children. That tell me the stories of how their children can't get enough to eat, they can't get access to hospital facilities, maybe they're on the other side of a front line. Those facilities, they can't go, they aren't going to school, they worry about their future, and they just don't want to let go. They want you to hear that story. And I think they want me to tell that story to all of you. And I think it's important that we remember that just how much of an impact this is having on the ground. The other point I would like to make before I describe perhaps what we're doing there is that I worry in a country that is now in the 7th year of conflict, what that does to the people, to the country over time. I've worked in many conflict situations. Sometimes conflicts have gone on for 20, 25 years, and such conflicts transform fundamentally countries. It creates generations of children who know nothing but violence, who don't have opportunities for employment, and don't have opportunities even to go to school. So this is troubling not only for today, but for the future. And this is why we believe we need a three-part approach to the situation in Yemen. Clearly, sustaining humanitarian assistance is critically important. Secondly, what can we do to improve the being of Yemeni through economic means, basically unlocking the economy from all of the restrictions and constraints that have been put upon it by the conflict, by the various parties involved in the conflict, and of course the search for a political solution, which is the ultimate solution to this. But that also has to be well done and inclusive if it's to be sustained. On the humanitarian side, in March, I presented our plan for the year and stated that we were on one step away from famine in Yemen. Fortunately, enough funding has come in over the last few months, particularly scaling up in May and June of this year to avoid immediate famine. We've taken a step backwards rather than a step forward towards famine. I think that's positive. But that is all at risk today if we don't continue to receive funding to sustain that humanitarian assistance. And we do okay in the areas of food deliveries and nutrition support, but we do very badly in terms of funding in areas of water, education, support to shelter, dignified shelter for internally displaced, protection, and of course health support to the people in general. So what we need is a strategy that complements that, that looks at incomes, that looks at prices of commodities, because much of the food is imported, and economic stability. And I'll just finish with that as my overall comments, because I want to give time for questions. But there are many opportunities to provide for increased income by improving the business environment, which could be dynamic, but is constrained by restrictions on importation, taxation internally, and many other constraints. There are needs in terms of getting the salaries for civil servants paid. They haven't been paid for a long time, and they're starting to drift away. We're losing that civil service now. And when we rebuild after the conflict, if we don't have the competent civil service, it will become even more difficult. There's also the issue of the cost of importation, the moving things in, the inspections, the taxation, war risk insurance. There's a long list of things that actually add each one to the cost of food and other essential commodities in their importation and distribution. We need to unpack that and find ways to get make food and other commodities cheaper and more affordable to people so that they have a dignified way out of this crisis and not dependent definitely on humanitarian systems. So I want to just close with that, just to say we need to really push for continued sustained humanitarian systems. We need to continue to push for unlocking the economy so the Yemeni people can take care of themselves better, even in the context of a conflict. And finally, the push for a political settlement is undeniable, and the continued energy and effort on that must be maintained until a sustainable peace is found. So with that, I just want to thank you once again for this opportunity to be here and to answer, of course, any questions that you may have on the situation in Yemen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David Grassley. In just a few minutes, I'll just ask a round of questions to our other guests. Donc, merci beaucoup, David Grassley. On revient vers vous dans quelques minutes.
We'll get back to you in some minutes. We'll just do a first round table and ask some questions to our other guests. First of all, Khadija Salami, you are yourself a Yemenite. You've made documentaries on the war in your country. What is your observation on what's happening today? The same as we've just heard. Unfortunately, for 7 years, we have generations that are desperate. They have no future. They are affected by this unjust and unfair war. They were born in this war, and it continues. And when war started in 2015, I was, of course, devastated, like all Yemenites, because we shouldn't have this war. And it came from the outside. Of course, there was an internal conflict which was about to be resolved. But all of a sudden, there was attacks coming from the outside. So Yemenites didn't understand what was happening. So you were talking about Saudi Arabia and also UAE and Iran. Even without the special envoy from the United Nations was very surprised. And that's what they said. They wrote an article in Business Week a few months ago to talk about this because they participated in the national dialogue between Yemenites to find a solution to fight in order that everybody can share the power and also have a democratic system. And that's why all Yemenites during the Arab Spring revolted. They went down in the streets to ask for democracy, for more freedom, for more dignity, for rights for all Yemenites, and against corruption. Because we had a system which was very corrupt, and this aspiration was taken away by a party, President Saleh, who was doing everything to stay in power, yes. But in the end, he gave over power. But he continued to cause trouble. Hadi was presented without any opponents, but this mandate should have been for 2 years, no more. And we should have organized universal elections and democratic elections. But he's always been opposed to that. So this led to a political conflict. And the UN, with their special envoy, it was back at the time Jamal Ben Omar, tried to find a resolution between the parties. And they managed to resolve this issue, this problem. And I'm going to cite just briefly, we don't have much time. There was an article saying after 10 weeks of suffering, there's been a compromise found. A calendar of transition has been constructed, and an agreement on the table. The UN Security Council has been informed, and I was in discussion with the Saudi responsible regarding an opening ceremony or a signature ceremony. And 12 days later, air attacks started. From my hotel, I could see the destruction and how the oldest city of Asana was destroyed. So that was how it was. So unfortunately, this war against Yemen was very well hid for 2 years. Even me, as a Yemenite, I wanted to come home to Yemen, but I wasn't allowed because you need Saudi agreement to be able to come home. And I always asked to come back, and my demand was always refused. And when I came back, finally, when I got the agreement, I saw the destruction. I saw what Mr. Grassley was describing. People are devastated. The first victims are women and children. We'll get back to that, but just to situate all the challenges of this conflict, Gilles Gauthier, I'll give you the floor. Can you just remind us what are the different actors and what interests they have? Is this working? Can you hear me? Yes.
Bon, d'abord, un mot pour vous dire que je suis effectivement conseiller.
He was the one who decided that I should speak here today, but I just want to say that I'm not speaking for him. I am a previous ambassador from Yemen, but I'm not speaking for the Quai d'Orsay. I'm talking about as a witness to what has happened in Yemen. You've probably heard, of course, you've heard of Yemen. It was the happy Middle East. And why did we say this? It's because it was the only part of the Middle East where it rained and where there was culture and business. And unfortunately, this Arabia, happy Arabia, is one of the saddest places in the world now. And through the Middle Ages and afterwards, there was a very sophisticated civilization, and it was quite prosperous. So what is happening today in modern times? In the 19th century, Yemen had sultans and imams, in the north and in the south. But they were invaded from both sides by the Turks, by the Ottoman Empire, because there were no Turkish people at the time. And this was around the middle of the 19th century. And then by the English from the south, who wanted to protect the Indian roads, or routes rather. And in the middle of the country, Yemen resisted. And there was always a space of peace which was never taken over by the English or by the Ottomans. Let's move forward in history. Now we are in an Arabia that is starting to be unified. And it became unified. And it was a province of Yemen. And the province of Najran, which is a Yemeni province. And so at the time, the Saudi Arabians started to show up in the picture. So who are the actors today? If you read the news, if you listen to the radio, we'll tell you that we have on one side a government, a legitimate government, a legal government, and on the other side, rebels. Rebels who are manipulated by Iran. What I see on the ground, of course, I haven't been to Yemen since 2012. But what I have seen, because I have a lot of contact there, I see that the entire north part of the country, okay, I'm talking about the internal actors first. They are controlled by the Houthis, and they're a party where it's about 3/4 of the population of Yemen. About 30 million people. In the south, there it's very complicated. There are many different people, rather parties. Some people are asking for independence, but they're being completely manipulated by the United Arab Emirates. There's another movement which has lost some ground. There's also militia. For example, the nephew of the old president, or rather the previous president, has his own presence. There's also Al-Qaeda, Daesh, or rather ISIS. They're very present. And there are negotiations with the Emirates and Saudi Arabia. So these are the internal forces. And then there are also people from different regions. And they're close to the Islamic movements. And that's about it. So this is what's happening internally. And externally, we have Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Saudi Arabia has been bombing. On the terrain, on the ground, they haven't been able to do much. They've never won any ground, but they keep bombing and destroying the country. And then there's another actor, the United Arab Emirates. In the south, they have been acting differently. They've been using militia with their own armies. Yemeni armies which are financed by them. And so they destroyed that part of the country. So this is the situation. And this is what justifies Saudi Arabia's actions. Every time we speak of Iran, we say, well, the Yemenis are not capable of having a war this way. The Egyptians did in the past. Gilles Gauthier, I'm sorry, we're going to have to interrupt you, but David Grassley is going to have to leave us soon. I will give you the floor soon. I just want to go back to David Grassley right now to talk about the two powers, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. David Grassley, before leaving us, I just wanted to ask you, is the humanitarian aid enough? Some people believe that it's just a band-aid. Would it be more useful for us to think of some economical solutions that would help us out in the long term?
Thank you for that question. I think very important one. There are many things that can be done to alleviate the poverty that we see, not fully, but at least in part, to make lives a little bit easier. I mentioned earlier there are, with the collapse of the economy, most people lost jobs and income sources, and the public service lost, they're not being paid. And just basic livelihoods are more difficult now. So it's important to target those three areas if we want to see some improvement and not full dependency on humanitarian assistance. I think that's what we're trying to do now, is working on a strategy within the UN, but more broadly as well, with partners on the ground. And they're very, very effective organizations on the ground to work with. The Social Fund for Development, I will cite as one example, as I've seen, does really good work. So there are ways to attack these problems. But just to give an example, I'm going to speak just for a moment on the public service side. I have three concerns on the public service side, the fact that they're not being paid. First of all, of course, if you're not paid, you're not getting income to help feed your own family. That's pretty obvious. But secondly, there will be incentives to leave and move on. And people do stay without being paid just to hold on to their job in the hopes of eventually getting a salary. But one by one, they leave, and they're replaced by loyalists to the authorities in Sana'a, and of course that just degrades the public service over time. And if we're not careful, we won't have much of a public service to work with at the end of this conflict. And we all know it's easier to rebuild infrastructure than to rebuild human capital. So I think it's extremely important that we find ways to sustain that public service across the conflict so that we have something solid to support after the conflict. And of course, sustain public service that delivers health, water, education on the ground. We channel our humanitarian assistance through, not all of it, but much of it through these systems. And so we don't want to create a parallel system if that fully collapses. So there's a need to find sustainable solutions to this. And by that, I mean not dependent only on grants from the outside, but better tapping into Yemeni resources. And I think that can be done. And there's a certain appetite by parties on all sides to try to find a solution. I'm not going to exaggerate the optimism on that, but I think there are opportunities to work. Without taking a lot more time, I will say this. It is complex. You've heard the description of the different parties involved in the conflict. But I have found that if you can change the conversation from linkage to political processes and de-link that and start talking in terms of what can we do to help the Yemeni people. It's important to realize both parties claim they represent the whole of Yemen. So you can take that argument and use it to try to actually advance a program to support Yemeni. One example I'll give, and I'll close on this because I've taken a lot of time. In the city of Taiz, the city is divided on the extreme north side under control from Sana'a and then from Aden, the bulk of it. But the bulk of the water that's produced for the city, or should be produced, is in the north part, and the bulk of the beneficiaries would normally be in the south part. We're actually having productive discussions on how to revamp that system across water front lines, the conflict lines, so that is not stopped for benefiting the people of Yemen. So to the degree that you can isolate people from the conflict, the consequences of conflict, I think it can be improvement And we shouldn't wait to do this until the conflict is over. By that time, we will have lost so much in Yemen. We need to do what we can do in creative, pragmatic ways to alleviate the kind of pressure and catastrophe we see on the ground in Yemen. Thank you very much.
David Grassley, avant que vous deviez nous quitter, je vous pose juste une petite dernière question.
David Grassley, before you leave us, I just have a little question. Who wants peace in Yemen?
All the mothers I've ran into certainly do. Most people want peace, obviously. The problem is getting the interest aligned so that we can get that. And that's where the art of the political mediation really comes in. That's why we should collectively support those efforts. Whatever path is required to find peace must be pursued.
Merci beaucoup, David Grassley, d'avoir.
Thank you very much, David Grassley, for being with us from New York and for giving us the time that you have given us today. Fatia Dazi-Hani, I'm going to give you the floor now. You've been speaking about Saudi Arabia and the role of Riyadh in this conflict. We hear a lot that Yemen has become the Vietnam of Saudi Arabia. Do you agree with this point of view? And why does Saudi Arabia stay in this conflict? Yes, we could even compare that Yemen has become the Afghanistan of Saudi Arabia, just the way that Afghanistan was that to the United States. It's the same kind of war. As Gilles said, Saudi Arabians bomb. They don't have any boots on the ground. They don't have any men on ground. And they are mostly in the mountains, and they are fighting warriors, the Houthis, people who know their terrain very well. Just like the American army was in Afghanistan. And as Jill was saying, the interference from Saudi Arabia is quite historic. They have always interfered in Yemen's business. There are 3 provinces, not just one, in Yemen. In 1934, there was an agreement. And in the north of Yemen, Saudi Arabia took over 3 of the provinces. And it's the agreement in Jeddah in June of 2000 where finally there was a border. In the meantime, Saudi Arabia has been interfering in quite a strange way. When we talk about the conflict from the Saudi Arabian point of view, so a Sunni state attacking the Zaidi part of Yemen, which is quite close to Shia Muslim Islam, a faraway cousin, related cousin. In the 60s, there was a Yemeni revolution, and it supported the Zaydis, the same Zaydis that make up the Houthis. And so this religious differences wasn't a part of the conflict. It was more about territorial dominance and tribal dominance. Tribal dominance is very important in Yemen, and Jill didn't talk about this before. And so they were able to corrupt the tribes. And this corruption has become endemic in all the different parties in Yemen. And this is the core of the problem. This is the root of the problem. Everyone is willing to be bought. The President al-Saleh was this way, and all of the stakeholders are this way. Everyone is very profoundly corrupt because people in power corrupt them. So Saudi Arabia, why did they wage war in 2015? Well, in 2015, there was the King Abdullah who died, and Salman, who came after, the famous MBS bin Salman, he became the Minister of Defense, even though he has absolutely no credentials. He is his father's favorite son, and he thinks that by declaring war in Yemen, that, well, because he's naive, and he says it too, he thinks that it would be over in 15 days. Because he had absolutely no experience politically or in the military either. His people close to him tried to dissuade him, telling him, it's a bit more complicated than that in Yemen. But the prince, at the time, convinced the king to not send men on the ground because he knew at the time that Yemen could not be taken over, that there were also fighters in Yemen who know the terrain and they know how to defend themselves. So this war, which started 7 years ago, here we are 7 years later, is in an impasse. Saudi Arabia is still involved, especially in certain regions, because the Houthis have been fighting, and they are the most powerful party in Yemen as it stands. So the Saudis kind of found themselves in an awkward situation because they couldn't use their power to negotiate peace. They tried to do so in April of 2021 when the Biden administration came into power, because Biden threatened the Saudis that he wouldn't speak to them anymore. If he did this, he called them pariahs during his... and so he decided, the Saudi Arabians decided to do a few things to look better in the public light. They let a few feminists out of jail. And in April, they decided to try to have a peace agreement. And the United States, they sent a special envoy, and they want to be invested diplomatically. They want to get out of this war. And they have asked the Yemenis and the Saudis to stop the bombings and to stop the war. So we're still in this confrontation in the region of Maritz. Today, Saudi Arabia has understood that they have lost this war, that militarily they are a catastrophe, that politically they have less and less means to negotiate peace, and that even if the Saudi Arabian even though there is quite a lot of repression in Saudi Arabia, they have become unpopular because they are very expensive. And with the different reforms that they have, Saudis pay taxes. The cost of living has increased, and we're continuing this war, which hasn't brought us anything. About 3 million Yemenis have left Yemen, and we're paying for their schools and their homes and everything. So there's this internal debate.
So I know that UAE might be a bit more discreet, but have they reinforced their hegemony in this conflict? So indeed, yeah, it's very insidious with UAE. They are very clever. They're all just as repressive. And however, I think they have managed to make some moves. So in August 2019, they announced that they take the troops back from Yemen, but that's a tactical retreat. So they are still there in the harbors. They're in Socotra, in the city, in the island of Socotra, where they want to implement a military base. And since they've signed the Abraham Agreement, they also try to introduce Israel into this geopolitics of the Arabic Peninsula, and in particular on the islands, with intelligence, equipment, military cooperation, and mostly, just as Gilles was saying, they're present thanks to their proxy, to their local allies. So these pseudist separatists who they finance, who they arm, and we were talking about it earlier, they have trained more than 900,000. So they have funding. And of course, UAE still is heavy in the balance, and in particular in Yemen. And it's getting more complicated. Saudis and the Emirates who are usually allies, are actually in conflict in Yemen. So really, the situation is complicated. Just to finish with a few words, Fatiha said that she didn't say that she didn't agree with me, but she told me in my ear. So I can say that she didn't agree with what I said on the role of Iran. So perfect. That was my question. I wanted us to talk about this third actor, Saudi Arabia. What's their role? You're saying they're less active, less important, but they still finance the Houthis. So the Houthis existed right from the years 2000. They were fighting in the north against the government of Ali Abdesali, but these were limited wars that were occurring each summer. And we were saying Iran. We said that they were behind it. So I asked the question to the Interior Minister back then. What was his name? El Armi, that's it. He was very nice, very open. And he told me, he trusted me. So he said, we have no proof, but we say it and it helps us. Let me take back the mic. So do we have proof? So that the Saudis have as an alibi the threat from Iran. Well, it's a big country, so between their Tehran or their influence in Lebanon, well, of course, they presented Iran as being, or Houthis, like being the fifth column for Iran. So there was a formation of the Hezbollah at the southern border of the kingdom. So the threat was huge, and intervention was needed, and that was Libya for interventions. And I remember back then, I was in Arabia, and it was extremely popular. This was supported and encouraged even by Jamal Khashoggi, who paid a heavy price. We know about this terrible episode. He was one of those who was a strong supporter of the conflict in Yemen, because there was this threat that was omnipresent. And indeed, in 2015, the presence, and even today, Iran on the field in Yemen is inexistent. It's still not the case. So, but however, Houthi, there are proof that they were trained, that they were financed. The weapons, well, Yemen is the country where there's the most weapons transiting. So everything that's constructed, so drones, missiles, all that, this is Hezbollah looking after it. Hezbollah, who is also allied with Iran, who has limited means because of the embargo in the country, compared to Saudi Arabia, who has more wealth. But also, yes, they are Hezbollah is the proxy of Syria and Iran. They are fighters, whether we like them or not. They are extraordinary. And Houthis took advantage and saw benefits from it. And it's via this, and Iran supports politically and openly the Houthi rebels. There's no doubt in that. Now, to say that Iran is just as present as Saudi Arabia and UAE, of course not. But so today, Iran, with this nuclear agreement, which is put on the table again with the Biden administration, they're also a bit stuck on Yemen, because Saudis say, we are happy to discuss with Iran, but you need to take decisions regarding Houthis. And Iranians say, well, actually, we have no means of pressure on these people. So here, it's a never-ending story. And when Iranians give advice to the Houthi rebels, they don't care about the Iranian advice when it doesn't go in their direction, because the Houthi rebels are the most powerful in the country, in Yemen. Yes, so between regions and strategic cities. So according to experts, Saudi Arabia and Iran could find new agreements, which following some meetings happening in Baghdad in secret. Following one of these meetings was to make sure there was no more tensions and solve regional issues between the two parties. We also mentioned the pressure of the US on Saudi Arabia. Do you believe, regarding the lack of management or the wrongdoings of these countries, do you think that a solution could be found? So what I think we shouldn't forget is that we are in a context where the US are taking a step back. They are removing themselves from these regions, and the Saudis and the Arab Emirates are traumatized, because when there was these attacks, these tank attacks in the Gulf, and in particular on the petrol factory in Saudi Arabia that was by the Houthi rebels, and that's why I go back to Iran. Houthi rebels were never able to strike as precisely these territories. So this is also a clear proof. And when Trump says to the Saudis, and I think it's justified, when he says you have sufficiently weapons to defend yourself, it's out of the question that one of my soldiers could pay for what Iran might do. So therefore, Saudis and Arab Emirates announced that they would remove themselves from Yemen and that they would sign an MOU, military cooperation for the control of military flow in the Gulf. And the Saudis, via Oman, because Oman also can play a role for peace. It's one of the actors. Yes, it's the Switzerland of the Middle East. And Saudis, in front of this, with Americans leaving, they're now opening the discussion and they're open to debate. So maybe the positive side of the US leaving is that now the regional actors are debating, they are speaking. So now what would that bring by? I don't know. Gilles, do you think we can find solutions between these big actors in the region? I really don't know how to answer your question. I'm no expert on this. I don't know what the leaders in Iran think. It's very difficult always to read their minds. But maybe you're going to ask the question. So far, we've talked about the internal actors, external actors with Saudi Arabia. But maybe there's also other countries that to a certain level are actors. These countries that provide weapons, for example, these would be, for example, France has always sold weapons to Yemen. And the Houthis have inherited of the weapons from the Yemenite army, and that was very sophisticated weapons. And that was when I was ambassador and Mr. Morin, Minister of Defense. We have weapons. We have sold weapons to Yemen, who are now in between the hands of Houthis. So others bring expertise, bring air information, like the US, the UK as well, undercover, but they still do, and France. And these countries, if they wanted to have a positive role, then they should act. They should stop selling weapons, and instead of supporting Saudi Arabia and the Arab Emirates, I think the word ally has been mentioned by the president of our republic, and I think it's very strong to say that somebody is an ally in this type of conflict when we're talking about criminals who are acting in this conflict. So I hope the regional actors will be wiser and will find a solution to their issue. And so, Rabija, who is blocking this political process internally? I think first of all, the first thing is money and weapons. Because also inside of Yemen, this is a profit for leaders in Yemen. So I think US pressure and UK pressure, they're not very present in the war, but we talk about them. We talk about France as well. And the pressure from the US is very much important to stop this war. And we need to stop providing money and weapons. Otherwise, it's going to continue. It's going to be never ending. And unfortunately, the Yemenis, even though that were acting with Saudi Arabia, they understood that that they want a war that is going to weaken everybody. And there are the interests of Saudi Arabia. They want a war attrition. They want the regions of the East. They're already there. Before they were the Americans, but the Americans left. And now it's the Brits. There's 400 expats from the UK who are there at the east of Yemen, at the border of Oman, because they want to have access to the sea. So as long as this provision of weapons and money doesn't stop, the war will continue. We're also talking about bombing, but I think the worst crime that's happening is the blockade. So Yemenis are in a prison. They don't have access to healthcare, to food, and the economy has collapsed. So all these civil servants are not being paid for months, and that for years even. So that's what's really a catastrophe. People are starving. And this is really the issue. So now for people, for the civil society, who would be legitimate to have power? So really to have democracy. Now they don't even ask for democracy. They want peace. They want to live in peace and safety. And before that, we wanted to be linked to the state. We wanted to have a legitimate state. And now in those regions where there's no existing state, it's a state that's living in a hotel. So there's nothing to do with public services. There's no link to citizens. We see insecurity, which is really present in the south regions, insecurity, famine. There's no public services anymore. And the last few weeks in Adan and in other regions, people went into the street to manifest, to fight against the coalition, against everything, because now they don't care about who's going to take power. All people want is to live safely, to have a job, to eat and survive. So really basic, have an answer to basic needs. And democracy, unfortunately, is a bit of a luxury in this situation. Time is passing, so last question before turning to our audience. A last question, therefore, for this debate. According to you, is peace still possible? And who wants peace in Yemen? Fatiha Dazieni or Gilles Gauthier, you have the mic. What a gentleman. Gilles, who wants peace? I think the people. I think everybody now wants peace and for foreigners to leave. So I think first there was hostilities against the Houthi rebels, and I have observed this, and now people just want peace and Saudis and Arab Emirates to leave. So people want peace, that's for sure. All those receiving money, so those who sell weapons on the international level, I am convinced. Maybe Fatia is less convinced, but I think 2 or 3 countries, even if they really wanted it, I think the US and maybe 2 or 3 countries in Europe, the UK, Germany, France, if they could be there for a dialogue, an internal dialogue with Yemenis, and if they could implement funding as well, because peace is necessary for reconstruction and development. There can't be any peace on the short term. For the short term, it wouldn't be peace, it would be fake peace. So if some countries would judge it's a priority, and then that would make sure that we can fix the world a little bit, then I think we could manage. Fatia? So maybe to challenge that, I think unfortunately this case is not on the priorities on the international level for the US. The US is very much looking forward to contain China. We have seen it. Yes, it's a future rival with their allies as well. They weren't being nice at all. So unfortunately, the priority on the agenda for the US is also maybe to get back on the nuclear agreement with Iran. It's also to fight jihadist groups in Africa. Yemen is really at the bottom of the pile. But as I was saying, the US have named a special envoy, and at the start of his mandate, Biden really put pressure on Saudis and Arab Emirates because he conditioned the sale of weapons to the Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia in order to stop attacks on Yemen and also to show a will for peace, which Saudis, with a peace plan that they presented in April 2021, said, well, we presented a peace plan and the Houthis refused it. So are we again going to be between these movements? The other issue is that this peace presented by the Saudis, they present it based on a UN resolution 2216 voted in April 2015, but which is not appropriate to the reality today. And I think the Houthi rebels play on that, and they are in a strong position to say there's no way that we will negotiate on that basis. So it's a fundamental matter of blocking. Not only it's not the main priority for the international agenda, but Moreover, there's also this question of the UN resolution, which isn't appropriate. Yes, because it's too old, it's outdated, and as we said it as well, who does he represent? He's now in Doha, in Riyadh, sorry. So not having your president there, he was legitimate for 2 years, no more. So if there was a real strong will on the international level, as soon as we put pressure on these Gulf states, they have to agree. They have to sit down around the negotiation table. But at the same time, nothing is done. They want to get out of the situation not in the best way possible, but in the least bad way possible. And I think they want to get out of this situation. And I think at some point they will abandon, but they could come back in force. As you said, Gilles, when we say about rebuilding the country and the financing it, who's going to finance it? The Chinese, of course, they're still there. But Saudi Arabia and the Arab Emirates have every will to stay, and those who contributed to destroy this country will then be the new peacemakers in some sort.
Khadija,
Khadija, I'm asking you the same question to finish. Who wants peace, and is it still possible? Yes, I think that the Yemenis want peace. And of course, maybe the countries that are selling the weapons. The Saudi Arabians don't want to get out yet because they don't want to lose face. But it's too late, Khadija. I hope so. But this is the problem. As Fatiha was saying, Saudi Arabia it means that the Houthis would take their weapons and leave the territory. However, the territory is their home. So it's exaggerated. But this will never happen. The war supports and reinforces the Houthis' intentions. We made them legitimate because they're the ones who are fighting the invaders. There is famine everywhere, that's true. But in the north, that is controlled by the Houthis, we don't see many people protesting because then they say we are fighting off invaders. But people will go into the streets and fight for their rights. But for the time being, we are fighting in invader, Saudi Arabia. It's very complicated. But it could also be very simple. Yemen has always had weapons, but they have never fought wars unless they have been attacked. Having a weapon is like having a tie in France. It's normal. But we have less issues with our weapons than they do have in the United States because it's cultural in Yemen and it's normal to have a weapon. People in power are corrupt, and if we have no money coming from the outside, then they will have to sit down and find a solution and negotiate because they're practical in the way they think. It's a tribal system, but when we have issues, we negotiate until we find a solution. This is part of our culture. But as we have interference from the outside and money coming in, the Yemenis are taking advantage of this. And they're taking advantage of the money coming in from Saudi Arabia. But now they're realizing that the Saudis are destroying their country. These are corrupt people. They're mercenaries. But they are practical people, and they can change their minds if they have to. Okay, so we're going to try and answer some questions from the public, from the audience. Here, I'll give you my microphone. Thank you for allowing me to ask my question. I have 3 small questions. The first is, concretely, how is humanitarian aid? What are the institutions and the organizations who are working with state-run institutions? Second is in regards to the blockade in the port of Daida. And the third question, perhaps you won't want to answer this question, in terms of geopolitical, do you have any idea how this war will continue? Thank you. It's unfortunate that Mr. Grassley isn't here anymore to answer this question regards to the humanitarian aid. I can speak of the blockade. When we talk of weapons coming from Iran, that doesn't exist. There's a lot of surveillance, very sophisticated, maritime and terrestrial and aerian. Even Yemenis have to declare when they come in and out of the country. The problem with humanitarian aid is that there's aid coming into Jeddah and to the port in Saudi Arabia. But it stays there for months or maybe even years until it expires. And so when it finally gets into the country, the food has already gone wrong. And because of the blockade, there's not enough fuel. And the lack of fuel means that we can't get around into countries, we can't get around in the country very easily. And so it stops us from being able to distribute the aid. And it increases the price of water, increases the price of everything to be able to distribute food. This is a huge obstacle. The blockade is a huge obstacle. It's a crime. No one talks about it. One of the first demands of the Yemenis is to get rid of the blockade so that we can have a chance at peace. But people are dying because of this blockade. In the port of Hodeida, with these 2 ports, the Houthis will not stop the war between them, and we can't mix humanitarian aid issues with political issues. Saudi Arabia keeps bombing the country every day because of orders that they receive. The Houthis will say, if you stop bombing us, we will stop fighting and we will stop the blockade so that we can... And in this way, we could perhaps have peace. Because in Saudi Arabia's peace plan, says, okay, we can intervene whenever we want to. However, the Houthis want to make sure that that their country is sovereign and that there will not be war anymore between them and Saudi Arabia. Fatiha, I think you had something to say? The end of Khadija's answer, even if it's not the scenario that the person asking the question wanted, we have the Saudi Arabians who had a peace plan. The Houthis have refused it, and Khadija explained why they have refused this. And so they keep throwing the ball in each other's court. Every day, says, well, no, we can't have peace because they've done this, and we can't because they've done that. And so now, as a specialist of this conflict are saying, it's a shame that there's not a map of Yemeni. Mareb is 120 kilometers west of Sana'a, and the Houthis control this province, and it's a very strategical province. This is where the fuel is used in this area. And this is why Saudis will not stop bombing them. They're trying to stop the Houthis from moving forward. This fight, this conflict in Mareb is fundamental. And deciding if it's going to be a long fight of low intensity, or if there'll finally be an agreement, a peace agreement. Or will the Houthis perhaps have an agreement with the separatists in the south? Many people think that if the Houthis take over Mareb, that they'll keep working their way down south unless they're able to share resources. And then the Saudis would be in a pretty bad position. So this is what we think might happen. Jules Gauthier, do you have something you want to add? Yes, it's very important, this conflict. But everything is possible. Anything is possible. People who weren't separatists yesterday are separatists today. This is a movement that has existed for a long time, even before the war. This movement, which is between autonomy and independence, is becoming more and more present. I've heard that people say that Yemen is condemned to be separated. I haven't said this and no one has repeated it, but until 1970, Yemen was separated into two states. In the north, which is the part that is ruled by the Houthis. And then there was the south, which is very vast. It was largely part of the desert, and this is where we find Aden. And the south, after the British got out in 1977, it became the only communist Arab country. So when the USSR collapsed in the 1990s, the south of Yemen realized that they could not survive, and so there was a unification of the country. But the unification is recent, and it was done, and it profited the people in the north. So there are still tensions, and so this is one of the stakes that could, some of the things that could be at stake if peace is achieved. Many Yemenis have realized that it's in their interest. And the Emirates are fighting for the separation of the South, as they always have, even at the time of unification. 3 or 4 years after unification, there was a civil war. And the Emirates and the British have always tried to separate Yemen into two, split. But France didn't. Even with the unification, except for all of the Gulf countries were against unification, and they did everything so that unification would not happen. However, with the will of the Yemenis, it happened anyways. And it was done even without their interference. Do you have any other questions? Just wanted to ask a question about the responsibility of the international powers. You've spoken about the sales of weapons, and then the Security Council, which you're saying seems to condemn the sale of weapons. And in the news, like in Arte, and I'm not going to talk about this in a moral way, but the interests of France and the United States, I think that it's in everyone's interest in the long term that this part of the world be stable, and that this part of the world not become a breeding ground for terrorists and a place of war. And these are the terrorists that hit the World Trade Center. They came from Yemen. Or rather, no, they didn't come from Yemen, they came from Saudi Arabia. 15 of the terrorists were Saudis, 2 Emiratis, and 1 Kuwaiti and 1 Egyptian. The person who was of Yemeni, he was bin Laden. He actually lived in Saudi Arabia, so he was only from Yemen briefly. But however, if Yemen, because war reinforces terrorist activity, they're very present over there. So it's not in our best interest that this country continue in this state. Moreover, when I was there in 2006 or 2007, the international community had focused on Yemeni, and they had talked about the development of Yemen. It's almost as if no one had understood that the situation was getting worse and worse. I don't think they did this purposely, but it wasn't a priority for anyone. It wasn't hurting anyone over here. Now the war is continuing, but we are profiting from this economically. We are benefiting from this, from the sale of weapons, which brings in millions of dollars. So you spoke about Germany a little while ago, and Germany stopped selling weapons a few years ago, and so they made a moral decision. Unfortunately, I think that they have started selling those weapons again since. But Germany, unlike France and the United States, sells machines. They don't really sell weapons. So this is a really great thing that the leaders in Germany have done. They have put pressure to put end to the conflicts. Yes, they don't sell that many weapons to the Saudis and to the Emirati. So I think this was a good action from the Germans.
Do we still have questions from the audience? So I had a question on COVID. We haven't talked about it too much. So what's the situation in Yemen? So on what's been the influence on the situation, on famine, and does COVID and the vaccination, for example, is that taken into account for the peace process? That's a good question, because Saudis, just as Emiratis, just as the Chinese, they implemented a vaccine diplomacy and a humanitarian aid diplomacy. As weird as it might seem, the countries spending the most on humanitarian aid are actually Saudis and Emiratis in Yemen. We've seen this in the press, but nothing arrives in Yemen. So what they show is dates. And they do huge posters. So what they send, are dates, the fruit dates. And then they show, well, here we've brought dates, and apparently people here, I'm just based on the World Bank reports. But no, actually nothing is happening. So they are managing the whole petrol and gas. They do not let the government use their own petrol and gas. Fishers are not allowed to fish on the Yemeni coastline, but Saudis are allowed to massively fish in Yemeni waters. So where's the trust there? I know that Médecins Sans Frontières is the only organization that in Yemen who's looking after COVID patients. Of course, in Yemen, it's not the priority because, first of all, they're starving. I think there's 1 or 2% of the population that's vaccinated, so it's really a minority as opposed to us. I'll now give the floor for a last question.
Merci pour la présentation et la discussion.
Thanks for the presentation and the discussion. I think it's very interesting to have various opinions on Yemen. I was lucky enough to speak with the Yemen envoy of UNICEF, talking to us about the situation there. 50% of the medical structures have been destroyed. And you, as a Yemeni, what do you think? Do you maybe have some more? You have probably some more knowledge on the population there. What are the options? How do Yemenis live this total absence of health support? There is cholera. There's no running and fresh water. There's a lot of people wounded from the war. So, are there hospitals that are implemented, and especially in the Houthi territory? So I'll speak about my experience when I was there at the end of 2017. I went to a hospital, the biggest hospital in Sana'a. There's a lot of patients, and there's not even electricity. There was no medication available, so people prefer dying at home rather than going to a hospital, and that's in Sana'a. So now imagine outside of the capital. The health care system is non-existent. There's no medication, there's no electricity. Many Yemenis, doctors left. They left Yemen. Many managed to leave. They are missing all public services. It's a catastrophic situation. I have my family there still. They caught COVID 3 times. For them, it's nothing, because there's other things to worry about. And these things are more important than COVID. For them, it's like a flu. But people are dying every day. They prefer dying at home rather than go into the hospital because they don't receive the appropriate care anyway. So COVID is nothing. When we talk about COVID, it's not their main worry. Fatiha, would you like to add something? Gilles Gauthier, no? Okay, well, in any way, we don't have any more time, so we'll have to free the room. Thank you to you all. Thank you for sharing.
On vous remercie d'avoir partagé votre...
Thank you for sharing your expertise, your experiences, and your thoughts. Thank you to you all for this debate, and I'd also like to thank the people who helped the organization, Xavier, Adrien, Lamia, Isabelle, and the mic. Thank you so much. And thank you to our partner, the Arab World Institute. I wish you a nice end to your day and a nice forum.